There are many things about the early days and years of the Church of England and Virginia that we do not know and that we will probably never know. That's because of the loss of the records. We take the tidbits of information that we have and we try to fill in the blanks by knowing how people behave, by reading some of their letters, and by looking at how institutions such as the church and the government evolved. In the earliest years of Virginia, the few ministers who came over here were in fact regarded by the Church of England as missionaries, not as parish priests. They were missionaries to the Indians in attempts to convert the Indians to the Protestant Christianity of the Church of England. But they were also missionaries to the settlers. In the very beginning, they did not create parishes. They held church services. They held church services wherever they could. There was a church building in Jamestown, and so far as I know, that's the purpose of the church from the very earliest days. These ministers were ministering to the needs of the people who were there. In 1619, the General Assembly more or less formally established the Church of England as the official state church of the colony. That's something that's very foreign to our understandings of the relationship between a church and a government. At that time, the Church of England in England was a part of the English government, and the English government was a part of the church. We think of church and state as something easily separated, that the church should not be involved in running the government, and that the government should not be involved in running the church. But that was not the case. Early in the 17th century, just a few years after the death of Queen Elizabeth, the memories of the English Reformation were still alive in people's minds. They still had a close affiliation with the Church of England, which was the state church. Parliament made laws for the church, governed how the church was to be run. The king was the head of the church. The Queen of England is still the head of the Church of England, the Anglican community. And the way that worked out in the colony was this. People came over here to settle, to plant tobacco, to kill Indians, to grip land, all these things that early colonists did. And the ministers came over with them to serve as missionaries. The longer the colony survived, the more formal the activities of these ministers became. So that by the 1630s and 1640s, the General Assembly was requiring the formation of local parishes. The General Assembly said the parishes should have specific boundaries, physical boundaries. The parishes should have a board of vestrymen to govern the church. The development of the church in Virginia was very different than it had been in England, where noblemen and rich people built a building, and therefore they and their descendants got the right to name the minister. There was nobody here to do that in Virginia. Ministers just took up residence and became affiliated with the church. Vestrymen came into being, and they later acquired the right to appoint the minister. This was a very important function of the government at the time, was to make sure that everyone behaved as a proper Christian member of the Church of England. Now, if you happen to be a Catholic, you happen to be an agnostic, or you happen to be an atheist, it was in your interest to be quiet about it. Because legally, everybody was a member of the Church of England. Legally, everybody was required to attend church. Legally, everybody who married was required to be married by the Church of England minister and buried by a Church of England minister. No other religious authority was legally permitted. Now, for the most part, most of the white people who resided in Virginia were members of the Church of England. Some more, some less committed, probably just like these days. Most people were surprised to learn that there was a very large population of Puritans in early Virginia. Now, there's Puritans and then there's Puritans. We all have this idea of the Puritans wearing their somber black clothing and refusing to have a good time and frowning on people who did. But in fact, that's not what a Puritan was in the 17th century. There were lots of differences of opinion among English-speaking people in the aftermath of the English Reformation. And the English Reformation was just barely over with when Virginia became the first of the English colonies in North America. So people were very keen on making sure that they preserved the essence of the English Reformation. But they had differences of opinion. Some people believed that the Book of Common Prayer preserved the proper religious ceremonies that were necessary to enable people to go to heaven or to avoid going to hell. There were other people who believed that that was excessively formal and that the liturgical service of the Church of England inhibited a proper inward manifestation of true religion. They tried to purify the Church of what they thought were antique relics of the past that did not serve true religion and a civil course of life. Those were the Puritans. They were the ones who wanted to get rid of some of the aspects of church government and the religious service that they thought got in the way of true religion. It doesn't mean that they never had fun. It didn't mean that they didn't smile. It didn't mean that they always wore black. It meant that there were differences of opinion within the Church of England community. And within Virginia, there were a great many Puritans, probably more Puritans in early Virginia than in New England. The ones in New England, however, tended to be the more radical sort, who refused to go to the Church of England, and they went to their own churches. And they instituted strict rules about who could become a member of the church and who could take part in church government, who could take part in the sacraments. That was not the case in Virginia, where everything was much more relaxed and more loose, and where the traditional Church of England service probably was what most people found when they went to their churches. So within Virginia, even from the very early days, there's a considerable degree of religious diversity in the population, mostly still within the larger, loosely organized Church of England tradition. There was never a bishop in North America before the American Revolution. There was never any church courts. The laws of Parliament about governing the Church of England, for the most part, did not apply in Virginia. And so Virginia developed its religious and institutional traditions differently than the way that they had formed in England. The colonists came over here, the ministers came over here, and they held church services, and the longer they were here, the more they began to develop institutions to govern the way that their churches worked. The parish vestries were more influential here than they were in England, and the church was also a part of the colonial government. The churches in colonial Virginia had a lot of responsibilities that we no longer think of as proper responsibilities for churches. The parishes were responsible in law for the maintenance of all the public roads. The parish vestrymen and the church wardens saw to that.